Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Gilman is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and it's part 10 of my Boomsday Project card review. This time around, 2 new legendaries, both of which are pretty insane. Also, some scary, terrifying class cards as well. If you're short on time, hit the quick reviews link in the description. Otherwise, let's go ahead and jump into some detailed reviews. So up first here, I have the card we've all been waiting for, and it's quite a doozy. This is Mecha'thun. It's a 10 mana, 10/10 mech, and the death rattle reads, if you have no cards in your deck, hand and battlefield, destroy the enemy hero. So this is another alternate win condition card, something we really only ever have one of that I can think of with Uther the Ebon Blade and his hero power. But if you satisfy all these conditions, you just instantly win the game. You don't have to do damage, you don't have to fatigue, none of that matters. You just win. But let's talk about these conditions because a lot of people I don't think are understanding exactly what they mean. Also, just how hard they're going to be to satisfy. Spoiler alert, almost impossible to complete these conditions, but there are a few ways. I'm not going to talk about all the possible combos in this video. I've read a lot of them already. There's one in particular I'll probably mention, but there's a lot of possible ways to do it. But first off, let's talk what it means, because the biggest thing people are forgetting with Mecha'thun is that your battlefield has to be empty. Now, at a very base level, we have to presume that means there are no minions on your side of the field when this effect activates, and maybe not even a weapon. It's not clear to me whether battlefield means weapon or not, but that might be an extra condition. Regardless, that one wouldn't be particularly hard to satisfy. But essentially, because you can't have minions on the board, that means that things like, for instance, Play Dead, the hunter spell that triggers a death rattle, will not work with Mecha'thun because Mecha'thun is going to still be on the battlefield. So you can't like instantly activate this with Play Dead, assuming that your deck and hand are both empty and Play Dead is your very last card. That still won't work. Your Mecha'thun has to actually legitimately die and be off of the board for this effect to resolve. So for instance, something like Deathwing wouldn't work either, because as soon as Deathwing activates that death rattle, Deathwing is now on the board and your board will not be empty. So there become 2 really big challenges for this card right off the bat. That's emptying your hand and your deck, which is not an easy thing to do, for the record. You have to play 29 other cards and still be alive. And then that's really challenge number 2, is building a deck that can do that and satisfy that and still somehow be in the game and have lived for that long and not already have won in some other way. Because frankly, if your deck can live through playing 29 cards all the time to get to Mecha'thun as a win condition, you probably don't need Mecha'thun as a win condition. It's just completely redundant, right? Because you've already somehow lasted that long. You probably won the game or stabilized in some way or another. So ultimately, you can just play it straight, play every card, everything else except Mecha'thun, play him down, assume your opponent doesn't have some sort of transform or silence effect for Mecha'thun, and then just kill off your Mecha'thun via taking trades or whatever else it is. And that's like the baseline way to do it. There are other sneaky ways to do it, and the only one I think is remotely relevant is probably with Druid, where they just draw through their deck really quickly, as Druid can tend to do with like UI and so many other cards. Play everything except for an Innervate and a Naturalize, and then they play Mecha'thun. They Innervate and they Naturalize it in the same turn. That's a total of 11 mana, which is possible for Druid. And that is an instant activation that is not susceptible to polymorph effects or silences or whatever else. So you can pull that off if you can play the other 27 cards in your deck successfully while staying alive, which might be possible for Druid because they do have a lot of life gain, a lot of card draw. That seems to be the only shell that will work for this as far as I'm concerned. A lot of people are looking at Rogue due to Myra's unstable element. That will make it fairly easy to empty your deck, and that would help you get to Mecha'thun faster. But I just don't think Rogue has a good, cheap, efficient way to guarantee that it goes off. There's things like Assassinate that can kill this minion, but that's like a 2-turn setup, and that just leaves Mecha'thun so darn susceptible. So what that means at the end of the day is that this card is pretty much impossible to satisfy. It's never, ever, ever going to work in a real Hearthstone environment. Certainly people will pull it off, and in wild format it might be even easier to pull it off, but it's going to stay a meme card. I don't think it will ever be a super successful combo deck just because it's too difficult, way more challenging than other similarly instant win OTKs that exist. So, Shutterwalk is just going to be easier to pull off. Malagos shenanigans are going to be easier to do. So Mecha'thun won't really have a need to exist when those other options are there for a combo game-ending style play. That means this card is mostly made for fun. It's not completely unbelievably awful as just a 10 mana 10/10, right? Like that could technically be a thing, particularly because it's a mech. It's something you can just get off, like Dr. Boom, for instance, his new hero power that discovers a mech, and you'll be happy to have a giant minion. That'll be fine in those scenarios, but not a card that you're going to build your deck around and actually make it a competitively viable thing. Not a card that's going to see much playing constructed, which is a shame because it looks awfully cool. But I do love the idea of the alternate win condition. This reference back to Cthulhu is fantastic. It's all super cool. So a very fun and interesting design, if not a particularly good one. So up next here, we have the new Warlock legendary spell, and it's been pretty quiet for Warlock so far in the reveal season, but here we have the Soularium, a 1-mana spell, and I think this thing is absolutely busted good. It reads, draw 3 cards for 1 mana, and then at the end of your turn, discard them. So pretty quickly, a lot of people are identifying this as a Quest Warlock empowering card, because essentially you get to discard 3 things without actually sacrificing any in-hand card advantage. Typically, discard now punishes you because the stuff you had is gone and you start to run out of cards pretty quickly, or at least run out of decisions pretty quickly. But this is basically a 1-mana spell that says satisfy half of your quest. And that's really intriguing. That will certainly increase the consistency of your quest activations when you get this in the early game. And that's cool, but ultimately, I still don't really think this is a Quest Warlock card, and I don't think Quest Warlock will be good because of this, because I've tried to make Quest Warlock work a million times, and even when you activate the quest super early, the 3/2 imps just aren't impactful enough. They're slow and passive, and they're, good maybe 10, 15 turns down the road, but in the first few turns, they're just not worth the sacrifice of that 5-mana play you had to make to complete the portal. So I don't think this is really a thing that's going to change Quest Warlock. It's certainly good for that deck, don't get me wrong. If it's going to work, this card will absolutely help. I think instead, this is just a good card on its own. Ignore the discard synergies. Just being able to get 3 cards into your hand for 1 mana is completely bonkers. And often, in the right kind of build, you'll be able to play all 3 of these and won't even have to risk the discard. Imagine this in a Zoo Warlock deck, for instance. Normally, Zoo, you're life tapping into a minion or 2, and you're pretty happy with that because you get to keep your pressure moving. But this suddenly, instead of having to life tap into a single minion, you get to play Soularium into 3 additional minions, or a couple Soulfires, or burst damage, or whatever it is you need, and you just play it all out, and you had a 1-mana 3-card cycle, which is stupidly powerful compared to other card draw options we've had in Hearthstone in the past. You could still life tap if you wanted to, so drawing 4 cards in a single turn as Zoo is like a little mini Divine Favor play that saves you a lot of mana to still accomplish stuff with your turn in those late game reload situations. And frankly, it's something you could even cycle in the mid game too, just to find a good thing and maybe discard the other couple things you don't care about, right? If you're like going into turn 5 and you're desperate for a play, you can Soularium with 4 spare mana, play a couple 2-drops and lose the other thing, and that's fine. This is not something you're going to be playing on turn 1 ever, right? It is at least relegated to the mid game for it to make any sense, because you do want to have some spare mana left over, unless of course you're seeing it in Quest Warlock. Then you could play it whenever you wanted and still take advantage of the discard. But outside of that environment, not something you're going to play early, something you're going to play later in the game, but is going to give you some insane results. I mean, just ridiculously efficient card draw. That's really, really scary, particularly in a deck like Zoo that thrives on being fast. I don't know that a more slow control style Warlock would want to use this as much, just because it'll be harder for them to play their cards and they'll risk discarding something really valuable like Gul'dan. But regardless, this doesn't have to work in every kind of Warlock deck for it to be really, really good, just because I think the effect is so strong and just so efficient that somebody's going to make this thing a core part of their deck, and it's going to help them find wins. It's just one of those cards that looks really, really good by the base metrics of how we value Hearthstone cards. And then there's that little bonus Quest Warlock option as well that might somehow make it even better and make that deck competitive. So all around, the Soularium to me just looks really strong. It does everything we want Hearthstone cards to do. This is a fantastic card. So now let's talk about Druid again. And it's a bit of a theme here with Druid cards. A lot of stuff that people are very quickly identifying as overpowered and scary good, which is probably the last thing Druid needs right now. And to follow suit there, Dreampetal Florist has been revealed. A new 7-mana 4/4 minion, which reads, at the end of your turn, reduce the cost of a random minion in your hand by 7. So you'll quickly say, 4/4 is not very good for 7, and you're right, that's true. But when a 7-mana minion carries with it a 7-mana discount, that's almost as if it's a 0-mana 4/4, because you're getting that 7 mana back at least once guaranteed with your Dreampetal Florist, assuming you have any minion in hand, and potentially getting it back over multiple turns if you can somehow keep your Dreampetal Florist alive or play it alongside a Drukhari Enchanter. Then you can get multiple 7 mana discounts, and suddenly your Dreampetal Florist very quickly starts to pay for itself and puts it at a 0 mana cost efficiency almost immediately, and then there's just more upside beyond that. So that's pretty interesting, and a 7 mana discount can do ridiculous things. Now, of course, a 7 mana discount is only going to count for 7 mana with bigger minions. They have to cost 7 or more for the full discount to apply, but even discounting something like Phlebinus Floop to 0 mana could be ridiculous, right? Even if it's just a 4 mana discount, that can still be great with a card like Dreampetal Florist, just because it sets up so many darn combo opportunities. Once again, more combo Druid cards. So discounting a Malygos down to 2 mana would be absurd with Dreampetal Florist, and you could frankly discount your Malygos down to 0 mana fairly consistently with a card like this. Now, the challenge will be hitting the right minion in your hand. In some cases, if you're running too many minions, you might not hit the things you want. You might hit low-cost stuff that you're just hanging on to. You might hit a high-cost thing, but not necessarily your combo piece. But it almost doesn't matter, because even if you hit a Ysera or a Lich King or any other just giant bomb minion, even a Sleepy Dragon or something, or a Dragon Hatcher, the tempo provided from this card is going to be fantastic, because you can play those next turn alongside multiple things and create this really enormous swing turn. And it does come at a sacrifice, don't get me wrong. You have to play a 4/4 for 7 mana. That is going to be the weak turn, and you're susceptible on that turn. This is a slow play. It's not a particularly defensive play. But here's the thing. In Druid, that's far less of a problem than in any other class, because you can get to 7 mana with Druid very early in the game when your opponent is still playing 4/4s, right? They're not playing 8/8s unless you're playing another Druid, because you've Wild Growth, you've Nourished, you're playing this thing on turn 4 probably, and a 4/4 doesn't look nearly so bad, and then you're discounting your Lich King, you're playing it and some other ridiculous card on turn 5, you're playing a Malygos pretty soon into the game with some combo stuff that just outright kills your opponent. So the potential for Dreampetal Florist to me does look really, really high. At a base level, it's got some problems, the stat line, the slowness of it immediately, but the payback is just going to be so enormous. And the potential to do just ridiculous stuff and swing the game super hard afterwards is so high, and just so good with Druid, because they have life gain, they have survivability, they have hyper defensive plays. They're going to be able to sacrifice a turn or two to set up something ridiculous, and that's going to help them win the game. Now, not every deck is going to want to run this. Of course, it's not perfect across the board. It's really best in combo decks or decks with really, really big minions, but that's what Druid does really well. So somebody somewhere is going to find a reason to play this thing. I'll also note that this works perfectly with Psych Melon, the new Druid card that was revealed previously that draws you a 7, 8, 9, and 10 mana minion. That means you can get your Dreampetal Florist and your Malygos guaranteed. And you might even be able to run something like a 26 spell deck that guarantees you always draw your Dreampetal Florist and Malygos, and you can always discount your Malygos guaranteed. Maybe even throw in a Phlebinus Floop too, because that wouldn't hurt. And boom, you've got a combo deck. Can Druid survive with 26 spells? Maybe so. I think they might actually be able to, just because they have so much life gain and so many different things. So no matter how you shake it up, I think Dreampetal Florist is going to see some play. It's not going to be a one of in every Druid deck. It's not that kind of card, but it's just strong enough that there is going to be a deck that likes this card a ton. So now let's talk about a new rogue spell, Necrium Vial for 5 mana. This one reads, trigger a friendly minion's death rattle twice. So we've got Play Dead here, which triggers a friendly minion's death rattle, the card for Hunter. But this one does it twice, 2 times as much death rattle triggering, but somehow it costs 5 mana. Something about the math there doesn't quite seem to add up to me. You take a 1 mana spell and you double it and you get to 5 mana. That seems fairly inefficient right off the bat. Now, I will say that anytime you bundle multiple cards effects together, you need to pay a little bit of a price because you're saving the actual card it's connected to, so it's easier to draw it. It's more power in a single card. So maybe 3 or 4 mana would be a sensible combination of a couple Play Deads, right? 5 mana, though, is starting to stretch it pretty high. Now, I think the reason for that is just to keep certain things in check, certain combos. Probably Blizzard knows what they're doing when they're designing these mana costs, trying not to break stuff, the kinds of things I don't often see myself when designing custom cards. I'm not sure exactly what they're trying to prevent. We may not even know yet because it might exist in a future set. But nonetheless, Necrium Vial doesn't look particularly cheap when it comes to mana costs, and in fact looks rather expensive because most death rattles aren't worth that much mana. Now, certainly there are some where you can summon some pretty big minions or destroy a minion, and in those cases, 5 mana would be reasonable enough, but in a lot of other cases, particularly with earlier game minions, you know, go to a Harvest Golem, for instance, the classic staple. A 2/1, 2/2/1s for 5 mana is a pretty bad return on Necrium Vial. So you've got to hit a point in the death rattle curve somewhere where it becomes good enough. Even with like a Devilsaur Egg, I guess getting 2 5/5s for 5 mana would be pretty solid, so that's a good example. There's, you know, ups and downs, and depending on the cards you're running in your deck, clearly sometimes it's going to feel okay, sometimes it's going to feel pretty bad. But that consistency is another part of the problem with a card like this, is how often is it going to be good, how often is it going to be bad? It's going to be stuck in your hand a lot because you're not going to have the mana or the time to play a card like this because it won't often be responsive or reactive enough or defensive enough in nature that it might just be something you can't afford to do right now. And other times the death rattle just won't line up. They won't be strong enough. So you might be saving this for that magic moment where you pull off something really big. And there's a lot of problems there with just having a card camped in your hand so slow. Now, I think one interesting application of this, though, is with the card Kobold Illusionist, which, of course, summons a 1/1 copy of a minion from your hand via its death rattle. You could do things, for instance, like keep a Malagos parked in your hand, play a Kobold Illusionist, and Necrium Vial that Kobold Illusionist so that it summons 2 1/1 copies of Malagos, which you could then combo with, say, double Sinister Strike. And suddenly you have a 26 damage combo possible with a card in hand and just, you know, 3 or 4 cards in play. So there are possibilities here for some pretty sneaky stuff. I hope I did that math right, by the way. 6 for the Sinister Strikes and 10 for each Malagos. That sounds right. 26. So there are some possibilities here for a card like this. It can do some cool stuff. I just don't think it's going to be like a general value piece in a Death Rattle deck. I think it's going to be too hard and too slow for that. But when it comes to combos or shenanigans, there might be more opportunities for this. Still, not a strong enough card on average. Pretty weak outside of those very specific moments. So up next here we have the Security Rover, a new mech minion for Warrior. This is a 6 mana 2/5, and it reads, whenever this minion takes damage, summon a 2/3 mech with Taunt. So we have yet another Warrior minion here, synergizes with taking damage to itself. Warrior's pretty good at that, historically damaging their own minions. They can do some pretty crazy stuff, and of course, getting a 2/3 back for every point of damage is a really big return on your investment. You're sacrificing 1 health on this minion, but you're gaining 2/3 in return. That's like a net gain of 2/2 each time this happens, not to mention those have taunt, so you can get a lot of bodies out. That's pretty intriguing, but ultimately, I think Security Rover has some big problems. Particularly, there's just a direct comparison to this card with this card to the old card Hogger Doom of Elwyn. You guys might remember this card from Whispers of the Old Gods, I believe it was. It was a 7 mana 6/6 that summoned a 2/2 with taunt every time it took damage. So for only 1 more mana, you got this really big body, and more or less a similar effect. The taunts weren't quite as good, but functionally they worked about the same. And although I always thought that card was a little bit underrated, it never saw much play, only very, very fringe play, occasionally in some warrior decks, but for the most part, a non-played card. And I think Security Rover just looks a lot worse at a base fundamental level because the stat line itself is so much weaker. It's far easier to die. It's not as threatening itself. The minion summoning upside is very minimal. So Security Rover looks like an unfavorable comparison to Doom of Elwyn, a card that was already fairly weak. Now, that leaves Security Rover in a pretty tough spot, right? It's worse than a bad card. That doesn't sound good. But, of course, the one saving grace for this might be the fact that it's a mech, and particularly with magnetic buffs, if you can cast magnetic buffs on this thing, then we've got a little bit more promise for it, right? Because you can get a ton of health. You can give it can't be targeted. You can do all kinds of extra things to keep this alive, and it will suddenly take more trades, summon more 2/3s, take more whirlwind hits, and it looks scarier. So I like the potential there, but again, that's still a big problem because you have to have so much mana and so much time for that sort of thing to work. You know, it's going to take multiple cards to get this buffed to a state you're happy with. It still might be susceptible to just single target removal in those instances. So you overinvest in a weak card to try to make it better. Your opponent still deals with it very efficiently. You'd probably just be better off running a good card in the first place that doesn't require quite so much effort to make it work. Because if you got to pour multiple resources into this thing, you're just increasing the risk that it all backfires and fails, and you haven't accomplished much with all those different resources. Just run a good card in the first place, and it stands alone, and it does its own thing, and you're much, much happier with it. Because it's, you know, if you get to turn 6 in a game, 5 health is very easy to remove with a single trade, just a spell, and you might only get 1, 2, 3 back with this guy. And a 6-mana play that summons you a total of 4, 8 in stats is just not that good when they're split across multiple smaller bodies. That's just not a thing we like to do that much in Hearthstone. So I don't think Security Rover is really going to make the cut much, even in a mech warrior deck. It just seems too passive and too weak. But I do think it's important for this card to exist off of something like Dr. Boom, Mad Genius in the Discover pool. It's one of those mechs that if you get it for free and it has Rush, that's certainly a little better because you can take those instant value trades into smaller stuff, start to get these bodies of 2/3s, and you didn't have to run it in your deck, so you didn't compromise the integrity of your deck much. So important for a card like this to exist, probably. It's going to be something that's good from time to time as that defensive last resort measure off of Dr. Boom, but I don't think it'll make the cut in a competitive list itself. So certainly an okay card. It's fine. It's just not particularly good. And then up next here, we have the Replicating Menace, a neutral mech, 4 mana, 3/1. This bad boy has Magnetic and Death Rattle, summon 3 1/1 microbots. So this looks a lot like the card Egg Napper that we saw in Journey to Ungoro. That was a 3 mana 3/1 that summoned a couple 1/1s. But for Replicating Menace, it's a 4 mana card instead, and you get 1 extra 1/1 microbot. You also get the mech synergy tag, and you get the magnetic buff. And frankly, I think that's quite a bit of extra stuff for only 1 mana. And although I don't think a lot of people like this card, I think it has some intriguing promise. I'm not saying it's amazing, but I wouldn't be surprised if this card actually did make the cut in mech decks, and that's for a couple reasons. Although as a standalone minion, I don't think it's fantastic by any means. 3/1 is a pretty weak stat line for 4 mana, but it is awkward to deal with still thanks to that Death Rattle, right? Like there are 4 different minions being bundled into this one guy. That can create a lot of friction, and it can also, you know, leave you in a state where there are some micro bots hanging out on board. It's one of those things where your opponent might be able to deal with a few pieces of this, but are they going to be able to clean up every last micro bot all of the time? I don't think so. I think usually 1 or 2 microbots will hang around after this sees the board, and what that means is that you're creating a base to build on for future magnetic plays. And that's really, really good, because then you can put your magnetic buffs into play immediately. You might cast your second Replicating Menace, for instance, on one of your leftover microbots, and then you've got this 4/2 minion that's summoning even more microbots, continuing this chain of magnetic connections that's a lot harder for your opponent to resolve, because all of your mech plays are now essentially buffs that go into play immediately. And also, just from Replicating Menace, I think this has the right kind of stat line in a lot of ways to trade up into stuff, because it's all attack and no health, and it's got downside. So it's going to create these opportunities where you can take a 1/1, buff it with Replicating Menace, and trade up into something larger for a lot of upside, because you get to take that stronger trade. It's almost like casting a Blessing of Might on something to trade up, but then you also get the microbots back. So I think this is kind of intriguing. It's almost like a Seal of Champions or something. It's not a good example, perhaps, because of the Divine Shield, but the idea being that it allows you to trade up without sacrificing much, and in fact, maybe even getting more stats onto the board. And that's pretty neat as far as a magnetic buff is concerned. This one's less about value trades and more about backloading those Death Rattle minions. So I don't really hate this card. I think a mech deck that's more aggressive might be able to use this as an intriguing follow-up that's a setup for future magnetics. It does a lot of neat stuff in that regard. And I think people might be overlooking this one just a little bit. It's not going to be a great late game mech, not a great control mech by any means, but as a mid-range, tempo-oriented mech play, I see some potential with something like Replicating Menace. And then finally here for my last card, this is the Arcane Dynamo, a 6-mana brain in a jellyfish. That's super cool looking artwork, but unfortunately I don't think the card's very good. It's a 3/4 for 6 mana. That is a big problem right there. Not a good stat line for 6 mana. And then the battle cry reads, discover a spell that costs 5 or more. And that's good because you get to discover a card, and it's kind of good because in a way it's a tutor generation because you're discovering something specific. I've said tutor a lot this expansion because Blizzard's finally giving us more control over our card draw or card generation. And in some classes, certainly, you could get a very select set of stuff. Like we just talked about Shaman, for instance, thanks to Storm Chaser, where there aren't that many 5 or more cost spells. You could almost always get exactly what you wanted in Shaman, or at least 3/4 of the time probably get what you want right now based on the pool. Other classes are going to have a pretty limited selection of stuff. For instance, with Mage, if you do this, you're very likely to get some sort of board clear, be it Flame Strike, Blizzard, Dragon's Fury. You could also get a Pyroblast sometimes, I guess. There might be other options too, but you're going to be able to get something within a narrow field that you really, really like. And that's good. That's nice for Arcane Dynamo. The question is, when do you have 6 spare mana to do that? And would you rather just run that card in your deck in the first place? Or is Arcane Dynamo a way to get a 3rd copy, perhaps, that somehow matters? I don't think so. I think this card's going to feel more awkward and too slow a vast majority of the time that you play it. A 3/4 for 6 just does nothing, and you can't combo the spell in the same turn you play the Arcane Dynamo without some sort of shenanigan, of course. So it's not like it's even an in a pinch emergency. If it was discover, if it was 5 mana and it said discover a spell that costs 5 or more, there might be some instances where you could line up both in the same turn, and that would make it a lot better. But you basically are investing in a future turn with your Arcane Dynamo. And if you're able to do that, if you're looking for a late game spell that's more control oriented and you've had the time to play Arcane Dynamo successfully, you're probably at a point in the game where you don't necessarily need a spell. You've already started to stabilize, you've already got time, your deck is working, it's winning the matchup. So I don't think Arcane Dynamo contributes to that success very well. And that's going to be a big problem for this card and a challenge. I just don't think anybody has a reason to run this right now. I'm not even sure this is very good in Arena. Might be okay, but that 3/4 stat line is pretty weak for 6 mana. So again, it's kind of a future loading your investment, and it takes forever for this to actually make sense. What that means is that at the end of the day, this card has a lot of problems and not a lot of potential in my mind. And that wraps it up for my detailed reviews. So now let's go ahead and jump into some quick reviews. Mecha'thun is a 2-star card. The Soularium is a 4-star card. Dreampetal Florist is a 4-star card. Necrium Vial is a 2-star card. Security Rover is a 2-star card. Replicating Menace is a 3-star card. Arcane Dynamo is a 1-star card. And there you go, guys. Part 10 of my Boomsday Project card review is done. Of course, share your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear everything that you have to say. But until then, thank you so very much for watching. And until next time, game on.